Jung's shadow integration technique saved his sanity during his Red Book period, but he documented 3 fatal mistakes that caused the exact psychological breakdown he barely survived. In 1916, one of Jung's patients attempted shadow work without following his 4-phase method. She was intelligent, psychologically sophisticated, had been in analysis for 2 years. Jung thought she was ready. Within 3 weeks of beginning shadow integration, she started experiencing what Jung called autonomous possession. The shadow qualities she was trying to integrate, rage, manipulation, cruelty, didn't integrate. They took over. She quit her job in a fit of uncontrollable anger. She sabotaged her closest relationships through calculated cruelty she couldn't stop. She began having episodes where she didn't recognize herself, watching her own behavior as if from outside her body, unable to intervene. Jung documented that the patient's ego structure proved insufficient to contain the shadow material. Rather than integration, we witnessed fragmentation, a splitting of the personality into competing autonomous complexes. Within 2 months, she experienced complete personality dissolution. Multiple sub-personalities emerged, each claiming to be the real her. She never reintegrated. Jung classified it as permanent psychotic break, triggered by premature shadow work. This wasn't an isolated case. Throughout his career, Jung documented dozens of patients who attempted shadow integration too early, too fast, or without proper method. Most never fully recovered. Today, I'll show you Jung's complete shadow integration method, the 4 phases he developed after years of trial and catastrophic error. You'll learn the 3 types of shadow material Jung identified, the 3 fatal mistakes that trigger psychosis, and how to know whether you're psychologically strong enough to attempt this work. If you're ready to integrate your shadow without destroying your personality, comment this right now. I face my darkness. But first, you need to understand what the shadow actually is, because most people's definition is dangerously incomplete. Most people think the shadow is just your dark side or repressed anger. That incomplete understanding is exactly what makes shadow work so dangerous. Jung spent 6 years documenting his own shadow during his Red Book period. What he discovered wasn't a simple collection of bad qualities you've rejected. The shadow is far more complex, far more powerful, and far more necessary than that. In his later theoretical work, Jung defined the shadow as everything you cannot see in yourself, positive and negative, that exists in your unconscious and controls your behavior without your awareness. Notice what's crucial here. The shadow contains both positive and negative qualities. It's not just darkness, it's everything you've disowned. Here's how the shadow forms. From birth, you receive constant messages about what's acceptable and what's not. Your family tells you to be polite, so you repress your assertiveness. Your culture tells you to be modest, so you repress your ambition. Your religion tells you to be selfless, so you repress your healthy self-interest. Every quality you reject to fit in gets pushed into the shadow. Jung observed that the shadow is the person you would rather not be. It contains the liar you pretend you're not, the manipulator you deny being, the cruelty you claim you don't possess. But it also contains the power you were told not to claim, the sexuality you were told to suppress, the wildness you were told to tame. The mechanism is automatic and unconscious. You don't consciously decide, I'm going to repress my anger. Your psyche does it automatically to maintain social acceptance and psychological coherence. Jung described how the shadow is formed through the repression of qualities incompatible with the conscious personality we've constructed. But here's what makes the shadow so psychologically dangerous. What you reject doesn't disappear. It becomes autonomous. It operates outside your conscious control. Jung documented that the shadow lives its own life in the unconscious, influencing your behavior, choices, and relationships without your awareness. The most obvious sign of an unintegrated shadow is projection. You see in others what you can't see in yourself. The qualities that trigger intense emotional reactions in you, rage, disgust, contempt, those are almost always your own shadow qualities projected outward. Jung was definitive. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Another sign is repetitive self-sabotage. You have a goal, you make progress, then something inside you undermines it. That's often the shadow asserting itself. You consciously want success, but your shadow contains beliefs like, "I don't deserve this," or "ambition is selfish," so it sabotages your conscious efforts. The shadow also appears in your dreams as threatening figures, attackers, criminals, wild animals, shadowy pursuers. Jung taught his patients that the figure in your dream that you fear most is often your own shadow trying to get your attention. But Jung discovered something that changes everything about how we approach shadow work. The shadow isn't your enemy. It's your disowned power trying to come home. Every quality you've rejected contains energy you need. The rage you've suppressed contains your capacity for healthy boundaries. The selfishness you've denied contains your ability to prioritize your own needs. The manipulation you've rejected contains your strategic intelligence. Jung's radical insight was this: to integrate the shadow doesn't mean to become evil. It means to consciously own these capacities so they don't control you from the unconscious. You don't act out your shadow. You acknowledge it exists, understand why it developed, and give it conscious, healthy expression. But before you can integrate your shadow, you need to understand that it exists in 3 distinct layers. Each layer requires different integration approaches. Confuse them, and you risk the exact psychological fragmentation Jung's patient experienced. Jung documented 3 distinct types of shadow material during his Red Book period and decades of clinical work. Each type exists at a different psychological depth. Each requires different integration techniques. Attempting to integrate a deeper layer before you've integrated the shallower ones is what triggers psychosis. The personal shadow contains qualities specific to your life experience, traits you personally rejected based on your unique family, culture, and conditioning. This is the shallowest layer and the safest place to begin shadow work. Jung described it as the totality of your unlived life, the person you could have been if you'd made different choices, if you'd been born into different circumstances, if you'd received different messages about what's acceptable. Common personal shadow contents include the anger you were punished for expressing as a child, so you learn to suppress it entirely. Now you're the nice person who never gets angry, but your shadow seethes with rage you don't acknowledge, or the ambition you were told was selfish or unfeminine or greedy, so you learn to downplay your accomplishments and hide your desire for success. Or the sexuality you were told was shameful or dangerous, so you disconnected from your own erotic nature entirely. Jung observed that the personal shadow is usually accessible through honest self-reflection and can be integrated without triggering severe psychological crisis if approached correctly. This is where everyone must begin. You cannot skip this layer and go straight to deeper shadow work. That's the first fatal mistake. The cultural shadow contains qualities your entire culture has collectively rejected and projected onto others. Different races, different classes, different nations, different ideologies. This layer is deeper, more dangerous, and harder to integrate because acknowledging it means questioning the fundamental values of your tribe. Jung discovered during his Red Book period that he carried not just his personal rejected qualities, but the collective shadow of European civilization. The violence, the tribalism, the will to dominate that European culture claimed to have transcended through Christianity and Enlightenment ideals. His apocalyptic visions of blood and destruction in 1913 were the cultural shadow erupting 1 year before World War I proved those qualities hadn't been transcended at all, just repressed. He wrote that the cultural shadow appears as the enemy, the designated evil that your culture projects its own darkness onto. For Germans it was Jews, for Americans it was communists or terrorists. For the religious it was the devil. The cultural shadow is always externalized, always blamed on the other. Integrating the cultural shadow means acknowledging that you contain every quality your culture claims to have eliminated. If your culture calls another group violent, you must acknowledge your own capacity for violence. If your culture calls another group irrational, you must acknowledge your own irrationality. If your culture claims moral superiority, you must acknowledge your own capacity for cruelty disguised as righteousness. Jung warned that integrating the cultural shadow isolates you from your tribe. The collective unconscious agreement is that we project our darkness onto designated others. When you refuse to participate in collective projection, you become threatening to the group. This is why cultural shadow integration is more dangerous than personal shadow integration. You risk social exile, accusations of betrayal, loss of tribal belonging. Most people choose the comfort of collective projection over the loneliness of conscious integration. The archetypal shadow contains universal human darkness that exists beyond personal or cultural conditioning, the capacity for destruction, chaos, and evil that exists in human nature itself. This is the deepest layer, the most dangerous to access, and the layer Jung himself nearly didn't survive during his Red Book period. Jung encountered this in the figure he called the Red One, a manifestation of pure destructive force that appeared in his visions. He described it as representing not personal anger or cultural violence, but the archetypal capacity for destruction that exists in the human psyche as a fundamental force, like creation, like love, like death. The archetypal shadow contains what religious traditions call the devil or absolute evil, not as an external entity but as a psychological reality. It's the part of human nature capable of genocide, torture, sadistic cruelty, not for survival but for pleasure. It's the darkness that every human being contains as potential, regardless of how civilized or enlightened they believe themselves to be. Jung's most disturbing discovery was that the archetypal shadow isn't pathology. It's part of the structure of the human psyche itself. You cannot eliminate it. You can only become conscious of it or remain possessed by it unconsciously. Attempting to integrate archetypal shadow material before you've integrated personal and cultural shadow is what caused Jung's patient's psychotic break. She accessed archetypal destructive forces her ego structure couldn't contain. The darkness didn't integrate, it possessed her. Jung's warning was absolute. The archetypal shadow should only be approached after years of successful personal and cultural shadow integration, and only with professional guidance. Most people should never attempt this level of work. But whether you attempt it consciously or not, the shadow operates in your life. Unintegrated, it controls you. Integrated, you control it. The question isn't whether to do shadow work. It's whether you'll do it correctly or trigger the 3 fatal mistakes that cause psychological breakdown. Jung documented 3 specific mistakes that cause shadow integration to trigger psychosis instead of wholeness. These aren't theoretical dangers. These are patterns he observed repeatedly in patients who attempted shadow work and never recovered. The first fatal mistake is attempting shadow integration before your ego structure is strong enough to contain what you'll encounter. Jung's patient who experienced psychotic break made exactly this mistake. Jung described how the ego must be robust and well developed before you can safely integrate shadow material. Paradoxically, you must be psychologically healthy before you can do the work of becoming whole. Think of the ego as a container. Shadow integration means pouring powerful, volatile contents into that container. If the container is cracked, weak, or poorly constructed, it shatters under the pressure. Signs your ego isn't ready include persistent dissociation or feeling disconnected from reality, inability to maintain basic life functioning like work, relationships, self-care, active mental health crises like depression, anxiety, or suicidal ideation, recent major trauma or loss, substance abuse or addiction issues, or history of psychotic episodes or personality disorders. If any of these apply to you, shadow integration work is premature and dangerous. You need to strengthen your ego structure first through therapy, medication if needed, building stable routines and developing coping skills. Only after achieving baseline psychological stability should you consider shadow work. Jung was adamant. Shadow integration is not for people in crisis. It's for people who are functional but incomplete, people whose lives work adequately, but feel hollow because they're living as fragments of themselves. The mechanism of premature integration breakdown works like this. You access shadow material, rage, sexuality, destructive impulses that you've kept repressed because your ego couldn't handle it. Your ego still can't handle it, but now it's conscious and demanding expression. Your ego fractures under the pressure. You either become possessed by the shadow qualities, acting them out compulsively, or your personality splits into competing sub-personalities, each claiming autonomy. Jung documented that the patient could no longer distinguish between experiencing shadow qualities and becoming them. She didn't consciously own her rage, she became her rage. She didn't acknowledge her manipulative tendencies. She became pure manipulation. That's not integration, that's possession, and it's what happens when ego structure is insufficient. The second fatal mistake is identifying with your shadow instead of integrating it. This is the inflation trap applied specifically to shadow work. Jung observed that when you first encounter your shadow consciously, there's often a seductive feeling of power. You've spent your life being nice and suppressing your edge. Now you're accessing your rage, your cunning, your capacity for dominance. It feels like liberation. But here's the trap. Instead of integrating these qualities, meaning you own them consciously while maintaining your full personality, you identify with them. You swing from, I'm the nice person who never gets angry, to I'm the person who doesn't take anyone's bullshit. You've just created a new persona based on shadow qualities instead of integrating them into wholeness. Jung described a patient who made this mistake. He had been passive, accommodating, unable to assert boundaries. Through shadow work, he accessed his aggressive qualities, but rather than integrating them, he identified with them. He became hostile, combative, burning bridges with everyone in his life. He traded one incomplete version of himself for another incomplete version, just with the opposite polarity. The warning sign is dramatic personality change. If shadow work makes you feel like you've become a completely different person, you're not integrating. You're identifying. Real integration looks like expansion, not replacement. You become more yourself, with access to a wider range of responses. You can still be kind when appropriate, but now you can also be fierce when necessary. You haven't eliminated your conscious personality, you've added to it. Jung taught that integration means your ego consciously owns shadow qualities without being possessed by them. You can access rage when needed, then return to centeredness. You can be strategic and calculating when necessary, then return to openness. The qualities become tools you wield, not forces that wield you. If you find yourself acting out shadow qualities compulsively, if you feel driven by darkness you can't control, if you're justifying destructive behavior as being authentic, stop immediately. You're not integrating, you're being possessed. The third fatal mistake is giving shadow qualities literal behavioral expression instead of symbolic, conscious expression. Jung discovered during his Red Book period that shadow integration requires what he called symbolic fulfillment. You don't act out your shadow in literal behavior. You give it symbolic form through art, active imagination, ritual, or controlled expression in appropriate contexts. He described the difference. When you discover your shadow contains rage, you don't go punch someone. When you discover your shadow contains cruelty, you don't become cruel. When you discover your shadow contains sexual desires your conscious personality deems unacceptable, you don't act them out. Instead, you paint the rage. You write the cruelty into a fictional character. You explore the sexual desires in fantasy or with a consenting partner in controlled role-play. You give the shadow qualities form and expression without letting them control your literal behavior. Jung documented a patient who made this third mistake. Upon discovering his shadow contained violence he'd suppressed his entire life, he believed authenticity meant expressing it behaviorally. He started provoking fights, acting aggressively toward people who frustrated him, justifying it as no longer suppressing his true nature. Within months, he destroyed his career and marriage. The critical distinction is this: Acknowledging shadow qualities means you're aware they exist in you. You own them. But owning them doesn't mean enacting them. You can acknowledge, I contain the capacity for cruelty without being cruel. You can acknowledge, I contain destructive impulses without destroying things. You can acknowledge, I contain darkness without acting darkly. Jung taught that the integrated person has conscious access to their full range of human capacities, including destructive ones, but maintains conscious choice about which capacities to express and how. Integration increases your conscious control, not decreases it. If shadow work is making you more impulsive, more destructive, more chaotic in your actual behavior, you're acting out, not integrating. Real integration makes you more conscious, more controlled, more capable of choosing appropriate responses to situations. These three mistakes, premature integration, identification instead of integration, and acting out instead of symbolic expression, are what transform potentially healing shadow work into psychologically fragmenting danger. But for those whose ego structure is strong enough, who can integrate without identifying, and who can express symbolically without acting out, Jung developed a four-phase method that actually works. After years of trial and catastrophic error, Jung refined his shadow integration method into 4 distinct phases. Each phase builds on the previous one. Skip a phase or rush the process, and you risk the mistakes we just discussed. Jung discovered that you cannot integrate what you cannot see, and you cannot see your shadow directly. You can only see it reflected in your projections onto others. The technique begins with brutal honesty about your emotional reactions. Every time you have a strong negative reaction to someone, contempt, disgust, rage, moral outrage, that's a potential projection. Jung taught his patients to ask, what quality in this person am I reacting to so strongly? Then comes the crucial second question. Where does this quality exist in me? Not, could it exist? Or might I have a little bit of this? The question assumes it exists in you, because if it didn't, you wouldn't have such a strong reaction to it in others. Jung documented his own shadow recognition process during his Red Book period. He found himself having intense negative reactions to colleagues he perceived as power-hungry, manipulative, or grandiose. The recognition came when he asked himself, where am I power-hungry? Where am I manipulative? Where am I grandiose? The answers were uncomfortable but undeniable. He wrote in his notes that I had been projecting my own power drives onto others, then judging them for qualities I couldn't acknowledge in myself. The moment I owned these qualities consciously, the intensity of my reactions to others diminished dramatically. This is the test of successful recognition. When you've truly owned a shadow quality, you stop being triggered by it in others. You might still notice it, might still disapprove of how they express it, but the emotional charge disappears. You see it clearly instead of reacting to it emotionally. The practice Jung recommended is keeping what he called a projection journal. Every day, write down what triggered you and what quality in the other person caused your reaction. Then write where that quality exists in you, with specific examples from your life. Don't let yourself off the hook with, well, maybe a little bit. Dig until you find the shadow quality clearly. One of Jung's patients documented this process. I was triggered by my colleague's arrogance. I listed where I'm arrogant. I dismiss others' ideas without fully considering them. I assume my way is best. I rarely admit when I'm wrong. I constantly position myself as more knowledgeable. Seeing this clearly was devastating, but also liberating. I've been fighting my own arrogance by projecting it onto everyone else. But recognition alone isn't integration. You've identified your shadow. Now you need to engage it. Jung developed a technique during his Red Book period that he called active imagination applied to shadow work. You don't just acknowledge your shadow intellectually. You have an actual dialogue with it, as if it were a separate entity with its own voice. The technique works like this. Find solitude and quiet. Close your eyes. Imagine your shadow appearing before you, not as yourself, but as a figure that embodies the quality you're integrating. If you're integrating rage, it might appear as a violent figure. If you're integrating manipulation, it might appear as a cunning trickster. If you're integrating ambition you've suppressed, it might appear as a power-hungry tyrant. Then speak to it directly. Ask, who are you? Why have you been rejected? What do you want? What gift are you trying to bring me? And here's what's crucial. Wait for the answer. Don't make it up consciously. Let the shadow figure respond with its own voice. Jung documented his dialogue with his own shadow of power hunger. I asked the figure, "Why do you exist?" It responded, "Because you've been pretending you don't care about influence, status, or recognition, but you do. And suppressing me makes you weak, passive, resentful. I'm not your enemy. I'm your ambition, trying to serve you." The shadow's response will often reframe the quality you've been rejecting. The rage you suppressed isn't just destructive anger. It's your capacity for healthy boundaries and self-protection. The manipulation you denied isn't just deceptiveness. It's your strategic intelligence and social awareness. The selfishness you rejected isn't just narcissism. It's your ability to prioritize your own needs. Jung taught that the shadow almost always contains a gift you've been refusing. Integration means accepting the gift while maintaining conscious control over how you express it. The dialogue continues over multiple sessions. You ask the shadow how it wants to be expressed. You negotiate with it. You establish agreements about healthy expression versus destructive acting out. Jung described this as giving the shadow a seat at the table of your psyche, acknowledging it has legitimate needs while maintaining your ego's role as the decision maker. One patient documented her dialogue with suppressed sexuality. I asked what it wanted. It said to be acknowledged, to be celebrated, to not be treated as shameful. I asked how I could honor it without acting destructively. It said, stop apologizing for your desires. Stop hiding your sexuality. Let yourself feel fully without immediately judging or suppressing. The dialogue gave me a path forward. But dialogue creates awareness. Now you need to give your shadow form in the external world. Jung discovered that shadow qualities that remain purely internal remain split off. To integrate them, you must bring them into external reality through symbolic expression. This is where most people get confused and make the third fatal mistake, acting out. But Jung's method is precise. You give the shadow symbolic form, not literal behavioral form. You embody it in art, writing, controlled ritual, or appropriate roleplay. If your shadow contains rage, you don't punch people. You paint the rage onto canvas with violent colors and aggressive brushstrokes. You write the rage into a character in a story. You go to a rage room and destroy objects in a controlled environment. You practice martial arts where controlled aggression is channeled appropriately. If your shadow contains manipulation, you've suppressed because you were taught it's evil. You don't become manipulative in relationships. You study strategy games where cunning is valued. You write about manipulative characters. You acknowledge that reading people and influencing outcomes is a skill you possess and can use ethically when needed. If your shadow contains ambition you've hidden because you were told it was selfish, you don't become ruthlessly competitive. You set ambitious goals openly. You pursue leadership roles without apologizing. You celebrate your successes instead of downplaying them. Jung emphasized that the key is conscious, controlled, appropriate expression. You're not suppressing the shadow anymore, but you're also not letting it possess you. You're giving it healthy outlets that honor its existence without letting it control your behavior destructively. He documented his own shadow embodiment during the Red Book period. He carved stone sculptures representing his destructive impulses. He painted mandalas representing the integration of light and dark. He wrote dialogues between his ego and his shadow, giving both voices full expression on the page. One patient described her process. My shadow contained cruelty. I'd suppressed my entire life. The capacity to wound with words, to take pleasure in others' pain. Instead of suppressing it or acting it out, I wrote fiction where my characters could be cruel. I explored that darkness through them. It satisfied the shadow's need for acknowledgement without making me cruel in real life. The test of successful symbolic embodiment is this. After expressing your shadow symbolically, do you feel relief? Does the compulsive quality decrease? Can you access the energy without being possessed by it? If yes, you're integrating. If you feel more compelled to act out, more identified with the darkness, more convinced you need to express it behaviorally, stop. You're crossing into possession. But symbolic expression alone isn't complete integration. The final phase determines whether your shadow becomes integrated wholeness or remains a split-off complex. Jung taught that the final phase of shadow integration is establishing conscious control and ethical boundaries around shadow qualities. Integration doesn't mean anything goes. It means you own the capacity while maintaining conscious choice about expression. This phase requires creating what Jung called an ethical container for your shadow. You acknowledge the shadow quality exists in you. You understand its origin and purpose. You've given it symbolic expression. Now you establish clear boundaries about when and how it can be expressed in actual behavior. For example, you've integrated your capacity for rage. The ethical boundary might be, I acknowledge my rage. I no longer suppress it, but I only express it in appropriate contexts, when my boundaries are genuinely violated, when injustice needs confronting, when assertiveness is required. I don't unleash it on random frustrations. I don't use it to intimidate or control others. I channel it appropriately. Or you've integrated your capacity for strategic manipulation. The ethical boundary might be, I acknowledge I can read people and influence outcomes. I no longer pretend I don't have this capacity, but I use it ethically to build genuine connections, to help people see their own blind spots, to navigate complex social dynamics. I don't use it to exploit, deceive, or harm. Jung documented his own ethical containers. I own my power drives, my grandiosity, my capacity for tyranny, but I channel these through my work, building a psychological system, training analysts, establishing my intellectual legacy. I don't dominate my patients. I don't manipulate my colleagues. I've given my power drive appropriate expression without letting it possess me. The critical practice Jung recommended is what he called conscious pause. Before acting on a shadow impulse, pause. Ask yourself, is this shadow quality trying to serve me appropriately right now? Or is it trying to possess me? Is this healthy expression or destructive acting out? Am I choosing this response consciously? Or am I being driven by unconscious compulsion? If you're choosing consciously and the expression is appropriate, act. If you're being driven compulsively, or the expression would be destructive, symbolic expression instead. One of Jung's successfully integrated patients described his process. I've integrated my shadow of aggression. I no longer suppress it, but I don't act it out inappropriately. When my boundaries are violated, I feel the aggression arise. I pause. I ask, is assertiveness needed here? If yes, I respond firmly and clearly. If no, I channel the energy through my workout later. I own it, but I control it. Jung's final insight about integration was profound. The integrated person doesn't eliminate their shadow. They develop a conscious relationship with it. The darkness is still there, but it serves you instead of controlling you. You become whole, not perfect. The sign of successful integration is paradoxical. You become simultaneously more conscious of your darkness and less controlled by it. You can access rage when needed, then return to peace. You can be strategic when necessary, then return to openness. You can be fierce when required, then return to gentleness. The shadow qualities become tools in your psychological toolkit instead of unconscious forces driving your behavior. But understanding the method isn't the same as knowing whether it works. Jung studied people throughout history who attempted shadow integration. Some succeeded and became whole, others failed and fragmented. The difference reveals everything about whether this work is worth the risk. Jung spent decades studying historical figures who underwent shadow integration work, some consciously, some unconsciously. Two cases reveal what separates successful integration from catastrophic failure. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1886. a story Jung later recognized as a nearly perfect depiction of shadow work gone wrong. But what most people don't know is that Stevenson was unconsciously working with his own shadow through the writing process. Stevenson lived a respectable Victorian life, proper, civilized, morally upright, but he was haunted by what he called darker inclinations, desires for freedom, wildness, and experiences his society deemed unacceptable. Rather than suppressing these completely or acting them out destructively, he gave them symbolic form through fiction. Jung studied Stevenson's case and noted that, through writing, Stevenson created a container for his shadow. Jekyll represents the conscious personality, civilized, controlled, socially acceptable. Hyde represents the shadow, wild, instinctual, freed from moral constraint. By giving his shadow literary form, Stevenson integrated it symbolically without being possessed by it. What made Stevenson's approach successful was precisely what Jung would later teach: symbolic embodiment without identification or acting out. Stevenson didn't become Hyde. He wrote Hyde. He explored shadow qualities through fiction, experiencing them imaginatively without expressing them destructively in his actual life. Jung observed that Stevenson maintained his respectable life while giving full expression to his shadow through his work. This is integration, owning the darkness while maintaining conscious control over actual behavior. Stevenson lived a functional, creative, productive life until his death at 44. His shadow became fuel for his art, not a force that destroyed him. The key to his success was maintaining clear boundaries between symbolic exploration and literal behavior. He could write about Hyde's violence without becoming violent. He could imagine Hyde's freedom without abandoning his responsibilities. The shadow served his creativity instead of possessing his personality. August Strindberg, the Swedish playwright, represents the opposite outcome: shadow integration without proper method, leading to psychological fragmentation. Strindberg, like Jung, was brilliant and psychologically sophisticated. He recognized his shadow, his rage toward women, his paranoia, his destructive impulses. He gave these qualities expression through his plays, creating some of the most psychologically penetrating works of 19th century theater. But unlike Stevenson, Strindberg couldn't maintain boundaries between symbolic exploration and literal behavior. Jung documented that Strindberg didn't just write about his shadow, he acted it out. He became possessed by the qualities he was exploring. Strindberg's 3 marriages all ended in bitter conflict, fueled by the rage he couldn't contain. He developed paranoid delusions that his enemies were trying to destroy him. He had periods of what he called the inferno, psychological crises where he couldn't distinguish his dark visions from reality. Jung noted that Strindberg's mistake was identifying with his shadow instead of integrating it. He explored darkness in his art, but then became the darkness. His ego structure wasn't strong enough to contain what he'd accessed. The outcome was tragic. Strindberg spent the last decades of his life oscillating between brilliant creative periods and psychological breakdowns. He died isolated, paranoid, and unreconciled with most people who'd been close to him. His shadow had consumed him instead of being integrated. Jung's analysis was precise. Strindberg accessed profound shadow material, but without proper method, without maintaining ego integrity, without establishing ethical boundaries. The result was partial possession, moments of integration alternating with periods of shadow domination. What separated Stevenson's success from Strindberg's failure? Jung identified the critical factor: the ability to maintain what he called the observer position. Stevenson could write about darkness while remaining aware, this is my shadow, not my total self. He maintained an observing ego that could say, I'm exploring these qualities symbolically, but I'm not these qualities. That's integration. Strindberg lost the observer position. He became the darkness he was exploring. He couldn't maintain the distinction between I'm experiencing shadow rage and I am rage. That's possession. Jung concluded that shadow integration requires simultaneous engagement and distance. You must engage your shadow deeply enough to understand it, own it, and give it expression. but you must maintain enough psychological distance to avoid being possessed by it. This balance, full engagement with maintained boundaries, is what makes integration possible. This is why Jung insisted on strong ego development before attempting shadow work. Your ego provides the observer position. If your ego is weak or fragmented, you lose the capacity to observe. You become what you're exploring. And that's when shadow work transforms from healing practice into psychological danger. But for those who can maintain the observer position, who have strong enough ego structure, and who follow Jung's four-phase method, shadow integration leads to the outcome Jung achieved himself after his Red Book period: wholeness. How do you know if your shadow work is actually integrating or if you're crossing into danger? Jung documented specific signs that reveal whether integration is progressing healthily or deteriorating into fragmentation. The most reliable sign of successful shadow integration is that you stop projecting your darkness onto others. Jung taught that as you own your shadow qualities consciously, you stop seeing them unconsciously in everyone around you. Before integration, you're constantly triggered by others. After integration, those triggers largely disappear. You can see the quality in others without strong emotional reaction, because you've acknowledged it exists in yourself too. One of Jung's successfully integrated patients described the shift. Before shadow work, I was constantly enraged by people I perceived as manipulative. Every interaction felt like a battle against deception. After integrating my own manipulative tendencies, I can now see when someone is being strategic without feeling personally threatened. I recognize it clearly, but I'm not triggered by it anymore. This doesn't mean you become naive or stop recognizing problematic behavior in others. It means you see it clearly without the distorting lens of projection. You can respond appropriately without emotional reactivity. Jung observed that the integrated person has access to a wider range of responses. They're not locked into single strategy behavior. Before integration, you might be compulsively nice because you've suppressed all aggression. After integration, you can be kind when appropriate and fierce when necessary. Before integration, you might be rigidly honest because you've rejected all manipulation. After integration, you can be direct when it serves and strategic when needed. Jung documented one patient's transformation. She had been pathologically accommodating, unable to say no, constantly sacrificing her needs for others. Through shadow integration, she accessed her capacity for healthy selfishness and assertiveness. She didn't become selfish, she became flexible. She could still be generous when it felt right, but now she could also prioritize herself when needed. The test is simple. Can you access opposite qualities depending on context? Can you be both soft and hard, both open and guarded, both generous and self-protective? If you're still locked into single strategy behavior, your shadow isn't integrated. It's still controlling you from the unconscious, or you've identified with it and created a new rigid persona. Jung discovered that unintegrated shadow material manifests as repetitive self-sabotage. You consciously want success, but your shadow undermines you. Integration removes this internal conflict. Before integration, you might get close to achieving a goal, then mysteriously sabotage it, missing the important meeting, picking a fight with a key person, making an uncharacteristic mistake. That's often shadow material asserting itself. You don't deserve this, or success makes you like those people you've spent your life judging. After integration, the sabotage patterns decrease dramatically. You can pursue goals without unconscious undermining because your whole psyche is aligned. Jung noted that when shadow material is conscious and integrated, it stops fighting your conscious intentions from below. One patient described the change. I'd been sabotaging romantic relationships for years, choosing unavailable partners, pushing away good ones, creating drama. Through shadow work, I discovered my shadow believed intimacy means losing myself. Once I integrated that fear consciously, established boundaries that let me maintain autonomy within relationship, the sabotage stopped. I could pursue intimacy without unconsciously destroying it. Perhaps the most profound sign of integration is what Jung called paradoxical self-acceptance. You become simultaneously more aware of your darkness and more at peace with yourself. Before integration, you maintain psychological peace by denying your shadow exists. I'm not angry, I'm not manipulative, I'm not cruel. This creates fragile self-esteem dependent on maintaining the denial. After integration, you acknowledge all of it. I contain rage, I contain cunning, I contain capacity for cruelty. But you're more at peace, not less, because you're no longer spending energy suppressing or denying. You're whole, not perfect. Jung reflected on his own process. During my Red Book period, I discovered I contained every darkness I'd spent my career analyzing in patience. This should have devastated me. Instead, it liberated me. I was no longer defending against my own nature. I was simply conscious of it. The paradox resolves when you understand that owning your darkness doesn't make you evil. It makes you complete. The capacity for cruelty exists in you, but so does the capacity for kindness. The capacity for destruction exists, but so does the capacity for creation. You're not defined by any single quality, you're the totality. Jung taught that the ultimate test of shadow integration appears in your relationships. Unintegrated shadow creates unstable relationships driven by projection and unconscious dynamics. Integrated shadow allows conscious, authentic connection. Before integration, your relationships are chaotic. You're constantly triggered, constantly disappointed, constantly discovering people aren't who you thought they were. That's because you were relating to your projections, not the actual people. After integration, relationships stabilize. You see people more clearly because you're not projecting your shadow onto them. You can handle their darkness because you've handled your own. You don't need them to be perfect because you've stopped demanding perfection from yourself. One of Jung's patients described the transformation. My marriage nearly ended because I kept seeing my husband as controlling, domineering, oppressive. Through shadow work, I discovered I was projecting my own disowned power drive onto him. When I owned it, I could see him clearly. He wasn't trying to control me. He was just being himself. Once the projection lifted, we could actually relate. If shadow work is making your relationships more chaotic, more conflictual, more unstable, you're acting out, not integrating. Real integration brings clarity, stability, and depth to relationships. Jung observed that integrated shadow becomes creative fuel. Unintegrated shadow manifests as compulsive, driven behavior, or complete creative block. The shadow contains enormous energy. All the qualities you've been suppressing require energy to suppress. When you integrate your shadow, that energy becomes available for creative work, meaningful pursuits, and authentic self-expression. Jung documented his own creative explosion after his Red Book period. The years of shadow integration unlocked decades of productive work, developing his theories, training analysts, writing prolifically. He wrote that, "The energy I'd spent repressing my darkness became available for creation once I stopped fighting it." But the key is non-compulsive creativity. If your shadow work makes you driven, frantic, unable to rest, you're not integrated, you're possessed. Integrated shadow creates steady, sustainable creative energy, not manic productivity followed by collapse. If you're experiencing these 6 signs, decreased projection, increased flexibility, reduced self-sabotage, paradoxical self-acceptance, stable relationships, and creative vitality, your shadow integration is succeeding. You're becoming whole without fragmenting. But if you're experiencing the opposite, increased projection, rigid identification with shadow qualities, more sabotage, decreased self-acceptance, relationship chaos, and compulsive behavior, stop immediately. You're crossing into danger. Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's your disowned power, your rejected vitality, your unlived life demanding integration. You're not broken because you contain darkness. Every human being contains rage, cruelty, manipulation, destruction as potentials. The difference between fragmented people and whole people isn't that whole people eliminated their darkness. It's that they integrated it consciously. You're not weak because you've suppressed your shadow. Suppression is what society demands for social functioning. You learn to repress unacceptable qualities to survive psychologically and socially. But what worked for survival doesn't work for wholeness. The question isn't whether you have a shadow. Everyone does. The question is whether you'll integrate it using Jung's method, or whether you'll keep suppressing it until it erupts, or attempt integration without method and trigger the fragmentation Jung documented in his patients. Jung's four-phase method offers a path from unconscious possession to conscious integration, from projecting your darkness onto others to owning it in yourself, from being controlled by shadow impulses to consciously choosing when and how to express them appropriately. But this work isn't for everyone. Jung was absolutely clear. Shadow integration requires strong ego structure, psychological stability, and the ability to maintain the observer position. If you're in crisis, if you're barely functional, if you can't distinguish between experiencing qualities and becoming them, this work is premature and dangerous. For those who are ready, who have baseline stability, who can engage deeply while maintaining boundaries, who can express symbolically without acting out, shadow integration transforms curse into gift. The qualities you've spent your life fighting become sources of strength. The energy you've spent suppressing becomes fuel for creation. The fragmentation becomes wholeness. Comment below which type of shadow material you're working with. Type 1 for personal shadow, Type 2 for cultural shadow, or Type 3 if you're attempting archetypal work, though Jung would strongly advise against Type 3 without professional guidance. Let's build a community of people doing conscious shadow integration instead of unconscious shadow possession or premature fragmentation. If this method for integrating your darkness without destroying your personality resonated with you, hit that like button. You've joined the rare few who understand that wholeness requires owning your full humanity, light and dark. Subscribe for more explorations of Jung's most dangerous techniques, the methods that transform psychological fragmentation into integrated wholeness. And if you want to understand where Jung discovered this shadow integration method, watch my previous video on his Red Book period, 6 years of voluntary psychosis, where he documented the entire descent and return. You'll see exactly what he encountered in his own shadow and how he survived it. The link is on screen now. Your shadow has been controlling you from the unconscious your entire life. Jung's method proves it's possible to integrate it without fragmenting. The question is, are you psychologically strong enough to begin? Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.